Desiree, are you on here?
I am on, and I just started the recording, so everybody is on record.
Great. Is Jennifer here as well?
I am here.
Great.
And Barbara's on also.
Oh, wonderful. Desiree, could you start by doing a roll call for my colleagues?
Yes. Here's my list. One sec. Okay. Mr. Constant.
Here.
Okay. Mr. Dyson. I don't think Fred's here. Miss Kennedy.
Here.
Perfect. Miss LaFrance. No Miss LaFrance. Mr. Perez-Verdia. No. Mr. Peterson.
Present.
Perfect. Miss Quinn Davidson.
Here.
Okay. Mr. Rivera. No. Miss Zalatel.
Here.
Perfect. Mr. Weddleton.
Here.
Okay, and Mr. Dunbar.
Here. I think I see Felix in the queue, right? Did he?
Oh, yep, he's on the attendee list, so I see him.
Maybe he was on mute.
I'm here.
Oh, all right. There's Felix.
Okay. Let's see here. Okay, great. Well, call this work session to order. I guess I should have done that before we took attendance. We'll be discussing AO 2020-39 and AO, what's the other number here? 2020-30 at this work session, both
It's
introduced by
Forrest, sorry. Just for the record, it's 29, not 39.
Oh, I thought I said 29 and 30. Okay, so 29 and 30. And if we could have, they're both introduced by Ms. Quinn Davidson. Ms. Quinn Davidson, if you'd like to present them or have Dean do so on your behalf, that would be a great way to get started.
Sure. Yeah, we're going to work together to present these two AOs that we're considering today. We had a pretty great team working on them. It included Dean, Barbara, Dee, Quincy, and I, and we're going to take turns presenting on different pieces of it. So we've been working on these two ordinances for almost a year, which is hard to believe. But we got started and stopped several times, including most recently because Barbara was needed for the election. So we were about to finish before the holidays, then got slowed down. And then when members were asked to delay items that weren't absolutely necessary in light of what was going on with COVID, I volunteered to do that. So we're really looking forward to finally discussing these and hopefully implementing them soon. We started doing this work for a couple reasons. One was to clean up code sections that didn't make sense or were outdated. And one was to streamline our meetings where appropriate. And then also to better engage the public. And you'll see sorts of like pieces of these themes throughout the two AOs. And in addition to the AOs and the corresponding AMs that you should have received by email, you'll also notice that we've prepared a crosswalk for AO 2020-30, which is Barbara's favorite way to summarize all the changes we're making. And specific to one of the items in 2020-30, Cameron and I have been working together on native land acknowledgement and adding that to the meeting agendas. So when we get to that point, I'll ask him to chime in a little bit too and talk about our efforts there. So we're going to start with 2020-30, which is the agenda ordinance. And we'll just try to go back and forth and have different people present. I think Barbara's going to get us started and generally run through it. I'll chime in with some thoughts. And of course, where there are questions, we can answer depending on who has the best capacity to answer. And then Dean can offer some legal and historical analysis. So Barbara, you want to get us going?
Sure. This is my first Teams meeting, so bear with me or tell me what I'm doing wrong. Desiree gave me a little practice, so we should be good. I'm trying to share the crosswalk with you right now. And you can either look at the crosswalk or at the ordinance. And at the top of the crosswalk, we're talking about the first section that changed, 2.20.050. That's on page 1. It's fairly insignificant. But on page 2 of the ordinance and the second item on the crosswalk, 2.30.035, the meeting agenda, these are some pretty significant and important changes. What is happening on that, excuse me, page 2 of that ordinance, the changes are that we've added the land acknowledgement, we've added early audience participation and moved appearance requests. They used to be at 12, now they're going to be at 9 on your agenda. We've added an explanation and a definition for the consent agenda. And similarly, at the bottom, we've added an explanation for ordinances for introduction. And I think we need to talk a little bit more about the appearance requests and audience participation, but I think it might be a good time to talk about the land acknowledgement.
Sure, I can take that over, Barbara, and then if Cameron has joined, he can add some comments. So land acknowledgements are becoming more common in Alaska and actually throughout the country. I was watching the Oscars this year and I saw them do it for the first time. And a land acknowledgement is a formal statement recognizing the Indigenous people of a place. It's a public gesture of appreciation for the past and present Indigenous stewardship of the lands that we now occupy. It's an actionable statement that marks our collective movement towards decolonization and equity. And that's the language that paired with this AO, which merely includes a land acknowledgement in our meetings. Cameron and I have been working on a resolution that would separately identify the specific land acknowledgement language that we could use. The reason we opted to do it that way is we felt it'd be easier to, and you know, Barbara and Dean and Quincy and Dee and I talked about all of this. We felt it would be easier to include the language in a resolution rather than code, so that should we need to update it, it would be easier to do so. And Cameron and I have been working with a number of Native partners, and he's been the primary lead on that, soliciting feedback to the language that we're about to propose. And we haven't introduced that resolution yet because we've been waiting for this feedback, and with COVID, people have just been slower to respond. So Cameron, are you on yet? Okay, my understanding is he would be here to talk about it, but I think if you all have any questions about why we're doing that, or, Cameron's waiting in the lobby, proverbially.
I just admitted him, so he should be able to participate now.
Thank you.
Hey, Cameron. So we were just talking about the land acknowledgement, and I gave a little introduction about why we're doing it and read the first part of the language about that would be in the resolution, is that first short little paragraph that describes the intent. And then I just introduced the idea of the work you've been doing with our partners. So anything you want to add or explain would be great.
Sure. Sorry, everyone. I was in the wrong meetings room waiting to be let in. I thank you for the opportunity to speak on this. I've had the opportunity to speak with a number of Alaska Native leaders and plan on doing more of those meetings over the next week or so, just to get perspective and feedback and ideas around this. I think the thing I would say is that there is a fair amount of the discussion and the debate about municipalities and other groups establishing these as a permanent part of their normal meeting process. And so I've been talking to people about that as well. My goal, and I think our goal, is to begin to normalize this process as something that we do, like we do the Pledge of Allegiance, and to acknowledge the people and the place that we're in. So I'm open to answering any questions that I can on it. I would just say that I think it's a really important step for us. I think that it will begin to model the kind of meetings and the kind of actions that many of us believe should happen in other areas of our world. So it's an opportunity for us to be a leader and for us to show others how we can move towards a more equitable sort of way of being. So I think that's all I have to say, but I'm open to answering any questions or sharing any additional information that I've heard from others that I've spoken with.
Mr. Constant, you're in the queue.
Thanks. Having not seen the draft you're working with, I'm hopeful that it is concise. The trick that we have in our meetings is things go long and get kind of really deep, and the Pledge of Allegiance is 30 words. That might be a little too spare. But whatever product is being developed, I'm hopeful that we'll be careful to make sure that every word counts and it's very tight.
Mr. Chair, can I respond to that, please?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. And that's definitely one of the goals. There's a few goals, I think. One is to make it easy to say. That's been one of the challenges that other places and organizations have said, that they've put a lot of words in and they're challenging to pronounce. And I think if that's another challenge, even though we want to recognize the language, it's important that we make it short, we make it easy to say, we make it relevant. Those are all really key pieces. This particular language has 2 sentences in it. I think it's 2 sentences that are before the acknowledgement. And it's simply an explanation of why we do an acknowledgement. And the rationale for that is that this is relatively new to most people. And there'll be a time, I think for a while, where we're still explaining why we're doing it and why it's important. So it's a very short, brief explanation of why you do a land acknowledgement and then doing a land acknowledgement. And I'm advocating for those first two sentences, because I think it's going to really help it become a normal part of what we do. And after time, if it becomes normalized, we can certainly take that out. But I think it's a really important piece in doing land acknowledgement. So just to respond to your question exactly, I do believe that this is short. It will take less than a minute to say, but we're open to, I think, shifting the language to meet the needs of the assembly. So thanks.
In addition to Mr. Perez-Rodilla, I also want to acknowledge you've been joined by Ms. LaFrance. Austin, do you want to continue with your presentation?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I also want to say hi to Miss Allard. Is she with us? Maybe not yet. She's waiting in the lobby. So welcome, Janie. We're excited to have you. So moving on, Barbara, should I go ahead and just talk about the appearance request and initial audience participation piece?
Yes.
Do that. Okay. So in the vein of better engaging the public, we wanted to make sure that there was a way for members of the public to speak on items not on the agenda before super late at night. As you all know, we often get to many of the items in the 14s. 10 or 11 at night, and that just isn't possible for many people with their work schedules or with young kids or whatever else to participate. And of course, they can always email us and call us, but we thought, and we've all discussed it as a group, I think at a rules committee before, that it made sense to try to accommodate some of those folks. And so what we've done is, beyond appearance requests, which we still felt should have priority because those people went to the trouble of making the request in advance. So we would allow those appearance requests and then allow up to 2 members of the public, should they be interested, to give initial audience participation. It would follow the same rules, so 3 minutes per person, unless of course it's community council. And the idea would just be to better engage with members of the public that can't be there late at night. Does anybody else from our group have anything to add or any questions about that piece?
Mr. Chair, I do have a question about the screen. Is someone who's controlling their shared screen, are they moving the document in relation to what Ms. Quinn Davidson is saying?
Yeah, we're just at where it says 2.30035 meeting agenda. And then the next column, each subsection change described below, we're in that box there. And so we added a title, we're doing the land. So yeah, and then Barbara is controlling it and she can scroll down as we move into additional items.
Mr. Weddleton, you're in the queue.
Sure. So on this 9B, it says up to 2 members of the public. And that's a trick. You know, if 10 people are there and the first 2 are one part of an issue and the other 8 have totally opposite views, we'd have a problem there. And I wonder if, you know, a better way to do is, you know, we will allow up to 10 minutes or some time limit. And if you have 10 people, they each get a minute, or say if there is time available before 6:30 or something, then we would do it. It's just, boy, just setting it at 2. If there's an explosive issue people want to talk about, we're in the midst of one now, that could be, you know, seen, we could look very biased. It may just be a real problem. So,
yeah.
I'm sure you thought about this. So
No, we did. And I think you're right, Mr. Weddleton. We were trying to find a way to balance. I mean, we could let public testimony take up the whole, hours if we wanted to. And so we were trying to find a way to balance to enable folks who just really couldn't do it later, and that there would be some sort of, the chair could make that call to allow those people to participate. But I agree, it's difficult, and I think we're open to other ideas. This is just what we landed on. But Barbara or Dean or anyone else, did you want to add something?
Mr. Weddleton, I would add that I think limitation is important because it does allow people to testify before the end of the meeting, but this is before you've even approved anything on your consent agenda. And I think that there is some danger if this was opened up, that the assembly wouldn't be able to finish the business that it's required to do. So I think this is a beginning, and I think if it works, you could expand it. But we tested a lot of ideas, and this was the area where the group landed.
Mr. Rivera, you're in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think I share some of the similar concerns that Mr. Weddleton has, particularly if we are, trying to be as welcoming as possible, bring more people into our meetings. And now we're saying, okay, now only 2 people can testify, or you have to wait hours before you can speak to us. So that's a little bit concerning to me. Also had a question. So for folks who decide to participate in this earlier audience participation, are they able to testify or speak on the consent agenda items?
I can,
Yeah, go ahead, Austin.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. And I agree. I think there are pros and cons of all of the approaches you take. I guess I'd like to remind the body that we had a discussion about 6 months ago on how many people we wanted to allow, and things maybe have changed, but we all decided together that 2 made sense. So I'm completely open to changing it, but I think given that direction from the assembly in a rules committee meeting, that's what Barbara and Dean and Quincy and Dee and I worked on. But I agree with you. And I think that, yes, we've realized that the only way to testify on something on the consent agenda is to email or phone in advance. And that this gives an opportunity if someone really wants to testify in a consent agenda item to potentially do that.
Okay, Mr. Constant, you're in the queue.
Yeah, thank you. I had previously understood, and perhaps my memory's wrong because it gets hazy over time, but that this was an extension of the public testimony at the end of the meeting. And so were we changing that standard that it could be on any topic? It could be on upcoming public hearings just past consent agenda items, so it's just wide open, any topic.
Yeah, this is, Mr. Constant, thanks. This is anything that's not on the agenda. So if, you want to testify on 14F, you can't do that now. It's like the general audience participation that's currently at the end of the meeting.
Okay, very good. I just want to make sure we weren't opening up the public hearings early.
No.
Thank you.
Mr. Constant and Ms. Quinn Davidson, you can see that item 9 refers you to 2.30.040G, and that section specifically says that you can testify on any topic. However, you can't testify on a topic that's the subject of a public hearing or the speaker's own appearance request.
Right. Thank you.
And that's on page 7. And actually, we suggested a few language changes to that too. So it's, in terms of organization, I don't know if it's better to go back and forth because they're connected, or if it's better to run through the more, succinct agenda presentation and then go into some of the backup. But we can just move back and forth if that's most helpful.
Ms. Zalatel, you're in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Going back to Mr. Weddleton's point, I don't want to create a situation where it's whoever can run up to the podium is first to get to fill one of these 2 spots. I'm wondering if there's some kind of hybrid approach to, like an appearance request, like we, there in the chambers, where you could almost fill out a form. I don't know, but some kind of hybrid approach that, like, we have these 2 spots, and when they're taken, so people know and can plan accordingly, versus, oh, well, I didn't make it up to the microphone fast enough.
Mm-hmm.
I am a little bit concerned about that, excuse me, because it could also put some of our folks who we do have like to speak to us, excuse me, and may rely on public transit or something, who also have physical disabilities or other impairments from getting there quickly.
Well, keep in mind, we're still going to have the audience participation at the end. This is actually making it easier for people to testify. So I agree with the first part of what you said, which is that there could be some challenge in determining who those people are. And I think we can talk more about that. But in terms of limiting participation, this is actually expanding participation.
No, I'm sorry. That's not what I was saying. I was saying that it would, in order to be able to, if without some mechanism, it actually would hinder the participation of those potentially with physical disabilities who might actually have valid reasons for needing to go home earlier because it can't make it to the microphone fast enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think in that case, that person could email the chair and say, or email the clerk's office and say they want to testify tonight. And then the chair could elect to give that person an opportunity to be one of the 2. So I think we can keep talking about how that decision's made. We didn't talk about that internally as much, but I think there are ways to address that.
Mr. Weddleton, you're in the queue.
All right, thanks. And I must have lost track of this, but my understanding of allowing more people to speak at the beginning was to let them speak on agenda items that would have a later public hearing. And that was for people, who have kids that can't stay super late or whatever reason it would be. But we're saying you can't speak on an item that has a later public hearing. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Watson,
go ahead, Barbara.
This is Barbara. Here is one of the concerns about allowing people to testify early on public hearing items. Number one, their testimony is not part of the record regarding that item. And I think that's really important that your record be preserved. For example, like on the luck, that you approved for AWU recently, that is a quasi-judicial item and your decision could be appealed to court. And when we have public testimony at the same time, all of that becomes part of the record in that court matter. If people testified on public hearings at an earlier time, those would not necessarily become part of the public, the record on that matter. That's one reason. I think that you do offer other options for people to testify or provide information to you about public hearings if they can't stay. you change the order of the day, and you accept email and other comments. I think this was an opportunity if people wanted to provide general comments to you, they could do it earlier in the meeting.
All right, we've got Miss Kennedy in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I kind of want to go back to the whole idea about trying to limit it to 2 members, and I'm just not interested in that in any way, shape, or form. And mostly because I guess philosophically, I believe that this is a public meeting, and though we are certainly going to be dealing with business and that's already on the agenda, and people will have those opportunities to speak to those specific items, you never know what's out there brewing and what somebody really feels passionate about that needs to come and talk. And if there's 3 or 4 people that need to do that, I don't know how you say, well, we're going to pick these 2 and not those 2. And anyway, you don't want to send the message that people are not welcome to come before the assembly to speak their mind. I mean, we are a democratic republic, so we're kind of all in this together, trying to figure out how to deal with any kinds of issues that are out there. So I don't ever want the public to think that they're not welcome at an assembly meeting. So anyway, I would hope that we would, I absolutely like the idea of sticking to a time frame. And it looks like we're pretty much doing that. We kind of have like an hour built in there, which I know how things go and things run over and things like that. But I would much rather just stick with the idea of a time frame and let people recognize that that's kind of their window. But we're not going to get to the point of saying, well, this person gets to speak and that one doesn't. So anyway, just my 2 cents worth on the 2 members speaking. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Mr. Constant, and what's that?
Can I respond to that, Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
Great. This is Austin. Thanks, Crystal. I appreciate that feedback. I think that irrespective of whether you limit it by time or amount of people, you might have people who aren't able to speak. So that's potentially a problem either way. I mean, the irony of this is it's actually allowing more people to speak because we're allowing time early on in the meeting and not just and late at night. But if it appears that we're limiting people to speak, which is not actually what's happening, I would definitely be open to a time I think we're here to receive feedback and make changes if we need to, and none of us is wedded to this. We're just trying to find a solution. So I appreciate, Crystal, how you gave a specific thing that we could change, because that's really helpful. And if people are interested in doing that, it'd be helpful to hear how much time they'd like to see.
So,
Thank
Mr.
you,
Chair, can I comment then too back
Sure.
on that? So thank you. And yes, Austin, I agree too. I know that we're not trying to necessarily keep anybody, but to really put into the ordinance, into statute, so to speak, that we were going to limit it to 2 members no matter what is a little bit presumptuous, I guess, on our part. And so that's what I was thinking, is I would much rather have the ability for people to come and speak knowing that they had an opportunity, rather than from the very beginning, we're telling them, sorry, we'll only take 2. So again, I agree that there's going to be times when you can't get to all the people that might be there. And then certainly when we know that's going on, we can find some other way to handle those conversations from those, or those testimonies from those people at another time.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we're better off sticking with the time frame than we are trying to say, well, from the very beginning, we're only going to limit it to 2 people. So
Right.
That's where I was going with that.
Do you have a suggested time frame?
Well, the fact that you put in there beginning no earlier than 5:30 and no later than 6:30. I mean, even if you actually use that as an hour's worth,
Okay.
I think you would more than cover anybody that could possibly want to come. And there might be occasions when, wow, you fill up that hour with testimony, but we know that typically doesn't happen. But I think we need to make room for that potential rather than just shutting everything down from the get-go. So.
Okay, thanks. That's good feedback.
We have, let's see, We have a lot of people
yeah.
we have a lot of people in the queue. I really want us to move on with the rest of, there's a lot in this ordinance. And of course, we'll have the opportunity to debate any provision on the floor. We got Mr. Constant, then Mr. Gates. Actually, Mr. Gates wants to respond to this point specifically. Then we'll go to Mr. Constant.
I do too.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to say I see that this is an issue, and clearly there's probably some proposed floor amendments for this audience, early audience participation provision. So contact me, we can work on that, but we have much more to cover in the half hour we have left. I encourage us to move on.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Mr. Constant, then Mr. Weddleton.
Yeah, so I am not in favor of opening a whole hour of time for public testimony at the beginning of our meetings unless we are intending to start our meetings earlier. We've had ample examples in the last year and a half of meetings that go to midnight or past 11. And so if we're contemplating opening an hour of public testimony on any topic someone wants to testify on, even items that are scheduled for hearings or not, we need to start at 4 or 4:30 so that we can ensure we're not running up to the midnight hour with an hour's worth of new business that we're planning to build into our agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Mr. Weddleton?
Oh, thanks on that. You know, I kind of lean like Crystal with, you know, sometime between 5:30 and 6:30. And I think in addressing Chris's comment, I think typically we are pushing, doing our consent agenda stuff. No one gets, it's about 6:15. Sometimes we have to hurry and go, we're not really done, and we go back to audience participation and go back to what we were doing. So it's not really like we're setting aside a whole hour. It's just if we have time before 6:30, we would open this up. And I prefer the time limit, but you know, I am concerned. I mean, I had actually thought we had landed on that people could talk on any topic, even if it's on a consent agenda. So if they can't stay late, they can say their piece. And if there's a note here saying it may not be part of the official record, I think most people don't really care. They don't even know what that means. They just want to have a chance to say, here's what I think on this topic. So anyway, I'd be looking at that. And I guess the question that Dean brought up, to the sponsors, are they looking to modify and make an S version, or should we just deal with this through amendments?
Can I respond to that, Mr.
Yeah,
Chair?
go ahead, Ms. Quinn Davidson, go ahead.
Thanks for asking, Mr. Weddleton. I wanted to mention that I'd be open to doing an S version. So perhaps Dean could collect different amendments, and then procedurally, I don't know the best way, but then we could talk about producing an S version. It sounds like there's maybe some disagreement, and so some might need to be handled through amendments. But if we can find comments that everyone seems to be in agreement on, I'd be happy to put that together in an S version.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, so let's try to continue through the presentation.
Okay, so we have addressed page 2, and then if we go to the next page, so on the crosswalk, we have done the order of business 2.30.035A. There's a couple of other things on page 4, but they're fairly routine. The only big one is we've added quasi-judicial or administrative matters at item 15, which is where we do them anyway. So that's something new. But now we're going to move to the next item on the crosswalk. It's the 2.30.035B laid on the table items. And again, this is an important change on page 3. So what's happening here first is, as you remember, last year, former Assembly Chair Eric Croft introduced an ordinance to address late on the table items. And so that's part of the reason this group was created. But we think that this short section B, and then there's going to be another section on the next page, C, really captures the issues with late on the table items. So if you look at the ordinance, B1, ordinances, there's no change. A member can at any time lay an ordinance on the table for introduction. You can bring it to the meeting on Tuesday. You can give it to the clerk's office on Monday. You can wait until 5 minutes before we adjourn and lay an ordinance for introduction on the table. That is no change. But number 2 is a change. What this says is that all other assembly items to be laid on the table require 8 members to approve just laying it on the table. Then what's really interesting about that is that it means that neither the clerk's office nor the chair has to make a decision if a laid on the table item is appropriate or should be introduced, which was some of the language in the prior ordinance that I think some of us were struggling with. So I like this because the assembly decides. Now, one of the things I'm going to ask you to skip, and I'm going to ask you to skip to page 5 of the
Barbara,
ordinance.
I'm sorry, Barbara, before you do that, we have 2 people in the queue. First, Mr. Constant, then Ms. Zalatel.
Okay, Mr. Chair, this is really important that I point out number C, because it is 100% related to this.
Okay.
Number C is supplemental materials. It says if you have an S, an S1, an S2, an AIM, an exhibit, anything like that, it can be laid on the table at any time and does not need a vote of 8 people. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you. Mr. Constant.
Just real quick, I just wanted to say thank you for changing that old business to unfinished business. Finally, our documents.
That was for you, Chris.
With our rules. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Ms. Zalatel.
Thank you. I have some concerns about the laid on the table change. With the particular examples, I understand it will be up to the assembly's discretion. I can see this actually being a large amount of debate. Sometimes items honestly get laid on the table due to the volume of work the folks who are assisting us have. And it's something maybe you've been trying to get through for however long, and it finally comes up, and members are then going to be pushed potentially 2 more weeks, or depending, sometimes longer on the meeting schedule, to have to wait to bring their item. And I'm just going over to look at that language again. Financial necessity, natural disasters, or immediate assembly action cannot be delayed. I mean, it feels like it can only be a very emergent item. And sometimes, I guess we have had in the past resolutions laid on the table with regard to upcoming legislation we want to maybe make a statement about. I don't know that those would necessarily meet that level. And I could see items not also making it through because maybe more for their substance than the actual timing. So I do have some concerns about that I wanted to raise. I will think if I can help create some solutions to those concerns.
And can I respond to that, Mr. Chair?
Go ahead, Ms. Quinn-Davidson.
So thank you. So Meg, that example that you raised about, pending legislation, say at the state level, that would qualify for an action that can't be delayed, right? Because if they're about to vote on something and we need to speak on it, that there's a timeliness factor there. There's 2 points of this new rule that we're proposing. One is to engage the public better. So right now we're laying things on the table that the public doesn't even see. And the public deserves to have from Friday to Tuesday to look at those items, those resolutions, and engage. And so I see the current practice as not engaging the public as well as we could. The second piece is you can always ask our colleagues to lay something on the table. And the only thing you have to show is that there's a timeliness issue, and that's why you need to do it. And then you have assembly members vote on it. So it doesn't keep us from doing it. It just discourages people from doing it when the timeliness is not a factor. And I think right now the clerk's office has been under pressure to add last minute resolutions when or the chair then needs to say to someone, hey, can you keep that for the next meeting? And it's uncomfortable. I think in this case, the assembly just makes the decision based on the content of what's included.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. I think I would have some suggested language, because as I read it now, when immediate assembly action cannot be delayed and the words exceptional circumstances, both of those seem much higher than we just simply may want to weigh in on an item or on something else. So
Sure, we're open to changing it if that makes more sense. So
thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rivera?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I actually had a question on the supplemental materials that Ms. Jones brought up. So I know in the past, it has been an issue when we've had an S version that's substantially different from the original that's laid on the table. And then we get into debate on whether we should take that up now or whether we should postpone it so that the public has more time to look at this substantially changed S version. So I guess I want to hear from the drafters on why S versions are not included in that subsection 2 that requires 8 votes rather than included in supplemental materials.
I can speak to that if
Yeah, go ahead.
It's a good point, and we thought about that. I think what we realized is that people would, if we included S versions in the rule, people would get around that by just creating a number of amendments, and we can't stop anyone from proposing an amendment and laying that on the table or doing a floor amendment. So we felt that it just made sense to allow S versions.
I think we can channel John Weddleton, and I think John's statement is that an S version is often a collection of amendments, and sometimes it's easier to read and understand what's happening in the collection of amendments rather than in a bunch of separate amendments. So I think that was the reason why we thought that S versions should be allowed.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. Mr. Constant, you're in the queue.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe Meg, I'll work with you on that language. The word only is pretty narrow to me. And so it might be that we have some language that widens that a bit, but I'll work with Meg if
Sure,
she'll have.
that's great. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Barbara, do you want to continue with the presentation?
Sure. So if at the bottom of page 3 and then page 4 and page 5, that's the executive session information. It used to be in the agenda, and we've moved it to a separate section. And Becky Wynn-Pierce wrote this, and I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but it is more similar to our current practice. The only other thing you can see in on page 5, there's just a couple of headings that we added. But I wonder if anyone else would like to talk about the new executive session page on 5 and 6.
Dee, are you on here? Did you want to speak to that since you worked with Todd and Becky on it?
Yeah, it was simply asking Becky to put it all in one place because we had been using it from various sources before.
Okay.
And were there any substantive changes, Dee, to the language that you wanted to highlight?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Ms. Jones, you want to continue with the presentation?
Sure. We're now on page 6 and 7 of the ordinance, and I'm going to scroll down here so you can see on the crosswalk. We're at, oh. Oh, there you go. We're at the bottom at 2.30.040, where we've talked about appearance requests and audience participation. So this at page 6 and 7 is the old section of the code that dealt with appearance requests and audience participation. And so we've just added a little bit of information here. It's fairly minor at the top, but then at the bottom in section G, we've already talked about that. And I think you understand that it says you can't testify on a topic that's the subject of a public hearing or appearance request. Mr. Weddleton, you could talk about a consent agenda item there. I think we pretty much covered that. If you go to the next.
Mr. Chair, just real quick before we move on.
Yeah, could you, when you are in the queue, could you please text me, because it's a little bit hard to see that screen with the ordinance popped up.
Thank you. And I will do that. The word initial or regularly scheduled, I struggle with that word initial a little bit, because if we do make these changes, they're both regularly scheduled. And so I wonder if we might not want to use the word early, late, or come up with some way to accurately describe them. But at this time, both of them will be regularly scheduled.
Sure. That's a good point, Chris.
Okay.
Okay, now we are at, I'm at page 2 of the crosswalk. We only have 2 sections left here. And at page 8, we're talking about, of the ordinance, we're talking about 2.30.050. It's just introduction of ordinances. And if you take a look at it, we've just added some subheadings so that it's a little clearer there. And then we talked a little bit about E, which is a little bit different. Now, one of the things that I'd like to point out about E that we're doing is currently the code requires, if you do an S version, you have to do an AM explaining the differences in the S or S1 or S2. Well, that has been a little bit confusing because an AM is required for all ordinances anyway. So what we said here is that you have to provide a supplemental AM that is explaining the differences. And I think that's about it for that section. The last section at the bottom of 8 and page 9, that is section 2.30.070. You know, it's an important section to me, and I've had people call me before, where is that section on voting? And you know, it's weird because the title of that section was disclosure of financial and private interests, and then it had voting at the end. So we rearranged the title so that voting is at the beginning. And then logically, the duty to vote is section A of that section. And it was always that way. We're just trying to break it up and make it a little bit clearer. On page 8, or I'm sorry, page 9 of the ordinance, our new B is the duty to disclose. And you know, that we changed that to follow the code of ethics, which before yours was, the assembly was a little bit different. It's going to be exactly the same as the gold sheets. We'll just make sure those are updated in your materials. But now they are both the same instead of slightly different. There is no change in our C and D. There's a couple of minor changes. You can see the edits on page 9. And then on page 10, Dean has made a note to us that D was misplaced, and it's addressed in another section of the code.
Ms. Jones?
Yes?
One thing here, if you look at D1 on page 9, I think there might be some, let me see here. It's still technically correct, but I think it's a little bit misleading. Starting in 2022, after there are 12 members, an affirmative vote of 6 members will still be a failing measure in some cases. So it might be something to consider, changing that language.
Mr. Chair, on that subject, interestingly, I was chewing on this in my head a minute ago. If you go up to the previous section we just looked at, where it says a quorum of the members, and I don't see that exactly in front of me, but
It's on 2.30.070A at the bottom of page 8.
yeah, and so I chewed back on this because I didn't know how accurate that would be, but I think if we stick to the language, a quorum of the assembly, that would resolve the problem down below. Even for the future, even when we have 12 members, because a quorum is always 7, wouldn't it? That might be a question for Dean, but I think a quorum would then be 7.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think in the interest of time, let's try to resolve that offline. I made a note of it, and I think thanks, Forrest and Chris. Great point. We only have a few more minutes, so I think we should move on. Quickly introduce the second ordinance. We may need to schedule another work session, and that's completely fine. But I want you guys to know sort of the basic content, and then Dee is going to talk a bit. So this is AO 2020-29, separate ordinance. And this updates our rules consistent with the current value of the dollar. So this AO moves some items that we currently see in the 14s to the consent agenda. Any of these items can be pulled from the consent agenda and have a public hearing if 3 members agree to do that. The advantage of moving these items to the consent agenda are that we will save time at the meetings, save staff time for staff who often have had to wait till 10 or 11 p.m. for their items to pass, typically with few or no questions and often no public testimony. And it will save paper and time on PACE since these items won't have to be produced twice because they won't have to be separately introduced as a public hearing item. The great thing is that any member can still request that we have a public hearing, and all they need to do is convince 2 others that it should happen. So we still get the benefit, but we just cut down on time when it's not needed. And so I think with that, I'll let Dee use the remaining time to give us an intro to it.
Okay, I thought a couple basic concepts at the front end might help. First, the word appropriation. Big word simply means specified unit of funding. You get a grant in, you pull the money down, you put it in an MOA account. Second concept is all appropriations associated with the budget. So let me put it this way, the annual budget process, those are all done by ordinance. These are appropriations that generally happen during the year. So they're not necessarily part of the budget. Now, having said that, let me confuse you about one thing. Some of these have been covered in the budget, but because they're occurring during the year, they have to go to public hearing under our current rules. Others of them are new things like grants. Grants are a big example of this. Every other grant we get from the state is over 100,000, and so we have to have a public hearing on it. Let me give you some of the examples of, and it's in the AM. Let me back up. There's 2 main threads here. One thread is a number thread. Current rule is if it's over 100,000, it automatically gets set for public hearing. So the first thing we said was, well, let's raise that. Does that make sense? That $100,000 was from a 1978 ordinance. When we adjust that 100,000 by CPI, it's almost 400,000 on one of the CPI indexes, and it's 329 on the other. So wouldn't it make sense to raise that number up? Because the vast majority of these appropriation public hearings late in the evening, there's no public testimony and there's no assembly comment. So that is just picking a number. So that's one thing the assembly needs to look at. But then the other thing was there's appropriation items that regardless of amount don't merit that type of time. And the big one is grants and donations. So you get a grant for the police to do DUI work for $800,000. And then they have a thing called a contribution from the police account. That's usually matching funds. And by the way, those matching funds often are in the budget. So it's one of the crossover areas. But we're spending an entire public hearing on saying, here's a grant, and we want to take the money and put it in the appropriate spot. So a lot of time on that. Another one that takes a lot of time, regardless of amount, is contributions from approved operating budgets. When we transfer from one to another, we do these resolutions. Again, some of those are already in budgets, but most of them don't deserve that kind of time. So there's two threads here. One is the amount thread, and then the other one is regardless of amount, there's certain types of these items that just don't merit automatically putting them on public hearing. And I think that's all I have for now.
Thank you, Dee. We have Ms. Zolotel in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to float a few thoughts I have about this because I will probably be bringing either an S version or putting forward quite a few amendments that might warrant an S version. One, to require items that now automatically trigger public hearing to require 3 members to get it to the floor for public hearing. I have grave concerns about that. Not grave, but serious concerns. Because we do have situations with the alignment on the body where you just can't pull that third person maybe that you need to get it to the floor. I'm also concerned about I feel like some of this is a little bit of, I understand saving time and efficiencies and the time and effort our staff and the municipal staff put in on this, but I'm wondering if there isn't something short of automatically taking them away from public hearing, but perhaps combining the public hearing for all appropriations into a single item per every 2 weeks, some kind of spreadsheet with the supporting information, and really knowing where it's at in the agenda. So one, it actually serve 2 purposes. One, hopefully truncating the amount of time to prepare the information. 2, truncating the overall amount of time for public hearing. And actually there's a third, which is we could educate the public very clearly that this is where you look at for our appropriations, and we can possibly have better public engagement around them. Anything right now rolling back automatic public hearing or engagement with the public process really gives me pause. And then on the grants, I understand we're matching, but we could have an administration, and I'm not saying this one, who maybe puts forward and wants a grant or has been offered a grant from the federal level to promote stop and frisk. It's just an example. And it's in the consent agenda. Consent agenda is hard for the public to necessarily understand and get through, whereas if it was set for public hearing, it would maybe be a bit more highlighted. So those are, and it may be something we want to make sure we're getting highlighted, or maybe only 2 members are really opposed to that, but they would like the public to speak about it. So I just see some concerns about how we're possibly tamping down the public process inadvertently in the name of trying to be more efficient. So I think there are some ways to address the issues, but yeah, so I will work on some things, but I just wanted to highlight a few of them, my thoughts about it.
Thank you. I don't have, Ms. Kennedy, you're in the queue. This will be the last comment before we move on to the next work session.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple, but I would like to say that I really do appreciate Ms. Zolotel's comments, because I think sometimes when you do things like that, where you think you're simplifying things or making them more efficient, but sometimes it allows more things to kind of fly under the radar, so to speak. So I do have some concerns about how we really will be able to better watch what a particular grant might be for and what it might be committing us to, that maybe the public has some good information on that we don't. So I have some hesitancy too about trying to do something that I don't think it's intentionally trying to leave the public out, but essentially that's what it does. And so I'll be looking at that a little more closely too. But I do have a couple of questions that I think Ms. Ennis might be able to answer, or whoever. But one of the things I kind of wanted to know is, do we have a sense of how many of these kinds of appropriations we would want to do in this way? I mean, how many do we typically do in a month or a year or whatever? And then the other question is, would we be putting these into its own category on the agenda so that we know that these are specifically those grant appropriations? So just some clarification on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Ennis, and then Ms. Quinn Davidson, and then we'll close the work session.
Well, if Ms. Davidson wants to answer, Quinn Davidson wants to answer these directly, or I can answer them.
Go ahead, Dee.
Okay, so the number of them, we just did sprinkling of looking at these, and it tended to be 5 to 8 the ones we looked at. You only had one on your last work session. Of course, I was had other items, 3 in a couple in February. So it really does vary, but I would say generally at least 3 and can be up to 5 to 8. It depends on the time of year, because when you have a lot of grants, it's after the state does their budget. So it really depends. Its own category, that sort of goes along with what Ms. Alatel is suggesting. Maybe we have them as its own category. Would be interesting, can we do that within the consent agenda, or do we do that still in the public hearing arena? And I think we could look at that. And I guess that's it.
Thank you. Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Sure, I'll be quick. I know we're out of time. I guess I just want to say thanks for everyone's feedback. I mean, I think that we currently often have meetings that go 7 hours long, and we still sometimes run out of time. And so I think it's really important that we as a team and as a body look at ways to streamline our meetings that actually involve the public more, because the public doesn't want to generally, I mean, a few members, but want to come and sit for 7 hours. So I think this is a way to move things quicker. A member can always ask for a public hearing, just like they can now for any consent agenda item. It updates the money amount to be reflective of the current landscape, financial landscape. And again, all you have to do is get 2 people agree. I mean, frankly, I think if 8 or more members don't think a public hearing is warranted, it's probably not. So anyway, we can, Mr. Chair, should we schedule another work session, or should we try to work on amendments and an S version and then regroup? Or what do you think makes, right now we're set to vote on this on the 28th.
You know, I think let's have people submit their comments or amendment ideas to Dean, and see if an S version is warranted on either. And then let's see here. I have no strong preference. It's really up to you. If you want to push it for another 2 weeks, we'll set another work session. If you want to bring it to the floor, and I think some of these things could be amended and then passed. I know you've been working on it for a long time.
Yeah, well, but I think it's more important that we incorporate everyone's feedback and hear, Dean's making a comment here, send him suggested changes and he'll incorporate it into an S version or amendments. So maybe that's the best way to do it, is everyone who has ideas, contact Dean. I guess then Dean will circle back with me and say, here are all the suggestions. Do you want these incorporated into an S version, or do you want them left as amendments? I assume that's the way we'll do it. And then we'll see if we can do that. I guess it would be great if folks can do that, by the end of next week, so that we can look at it on the 28th. And we'll try to do that. And then if for some reason that's not possible, we'll go from there.
Yeah, I think that's the preferred way to do it.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chair. And thanks everyone for your feedback, and the team who worked on this too.
Thank you. Desiree, so we're going to close this work session. Do we get into another meeting, or do we stay on this line?
So everybody's going to hang up this meeting. If you're on Teams and you hover over the middle of your screen, you'll see the little hang up button. Do that. If you're on the phone, hang up and dial into the other meeting, and then you're going to join the budget work session.
And before you all do that, sorry to interrupt, but Dean is clarifying amendments need to get in by next Thursday, which makes sense because we'd put them on the addendum. So please, by next Thursday, let us all know, or let him know. Thank you.
Great. Good. All right. So this work session is adjourned, and we'll take just a couple minute. We'll get into the next work session, but we'll probably take a couple minute break before we actually get it rolling. Thank you.
Thank you.